The African continent is one big continent that has a history where its people have been oppressed, suppressed, sold into slavery, whose rights have been taken away from them forcefully, a people whose lands were invaded, just a people who were colonized by those of European descent. And those are just historical facts that are readily available and are out there. Now, with colonization came laws and systems that were put in place, and more often than not, these laws and systems favored the colonizers. And these laws and systems directly affected how African people practice their African spirituality. It affected how they conducted their customs and their rituals. It affected their day-to-day lives. Their whole lifestyles was affected by these laws that were set in place. It was so deep to such an extent that it influenced and affected who or what African people worshipped, even till this day. And the African continent, we are in search, really. We want to know what African people, what our forefathers worshipped, or who our forefathers worshipped, what our forefathers believed in, and how they conducted their worship before colonization and slavery happened on our continent, right? And a lot of examples can be found throughout the African continent where illustrations of these, where I can make illustration of these laws and systems that were put in place. Now, in a lot of geographical areas on the African continent, some of these laws have now been removed as countries are no longer colonized anymore and have had now their independence and and live in democratic states. However, there are still some nations that are holding on to these laws and systems. Okay, so I'm about to give just a few examples of nations that had laws that suppressed African spirituality. And first up would be Nigeria. Yes, Niger. Our sisters and brothers in Nigeria now. Nigeria was previously colonized by Britain. It was previously known as a British colony, and its criminal law system is heavily influenced by English law because of colonization. So the laws that were established in Nigeria were laws that were based on the values and way of life of the English people, and it did not consider the African indigenous people of Nigeria. So out of these laws, after much rejection from Nigerians, however, eventually they became law for the whole of Nigeria. The Criminal Code Act is the main act that suppresses African spirituality, namely the part chapter 20 of the Criminal Code Act. It suppresses African spirituality, or it suppressed African spirituality in Nigeria. It prevented anybody who would declare or outright state that they possessed any type of superpower or supernatural abilities. It prevented that. It also prevented anybody who was able to have the knowledge and skill to mix traditional medicine and resell it. It prevented the use of natural herbs. So if you were caught mixing your aloe, you'd be in jail. Okay. It also prevented any person who, in a form or places of worship, who was able to invoke or, you know, summon any form of spirit. It prevented that. And you know, in Nigeria they call it juju. So it coined everything that pertained to spirituality as evil and criminalized it. So if you were found doing any of those, you would be arrested. You would be acting against the law. And that greatly suppressed African spirituality in Nigeria. And another perfect example that I can give would be Namibia. Now, Namibia was previously colonized by Germany, yes, the Dutch, and then it was later ruled or governed under the apartheid of South Africa, and then thereafter it gained its independence. However, the Witchcraft Suppression Proclamation, which was established and put into effect in Namibia, did not allow people to practice their African spirituality. Similar to the Nigerian Criminal Code Act, it prevented people from making use of natural plants, making use of wizards, sorcery, traditional healers, seers, diviners, anybody who would be able to possess any supernatural ability. It also prevents anybody from calling any other person as a witch. However, you might think that's a good thing, right? But in actual fact, these laws perpetrated witch hunts in these areas, in fact throughout Africa, because many people of Namibia were excommuned once they were believed to be witches. It perpetrated witch hunts where people now, if you had a spiritual gift, spiritual calling, or you were just exercising your African spirituality, you were deemed as a witch. But these laws don't clearly define what a witch is, what a prophet is, what a seer is, or what a herbalist is. It simply prohibits anybody who participated in their African spirituality in any shape, way, or form. So this did not allow anybody to practice African spirituality. As a result, a lot of Africans thereafter decided that they would then try to use their gifts in the Christianity that was now brought in, the religion that was now forced into their lives. You know, they had to adjust and make alternatives to make use of their gifts in a manner that would not bring any repercussions into their lives. Now, finally, another great example would be the creme de la creme of the continent. The giants of Africa. I'm joking. There is no giant of Africa in Africa. South Africa, well, ultimately was, I'll say, colonized by Britain. However, that happened after much back and forth from its colonizers, which were both the British and the Dutch, and who fought over dominion about who would dominate South Africa. So a lot of Boer died during the Anglo-Boer Wars because of this power struggle. Obviously now the Britain grew more powerful in South Africa. So prior to South Africa becoming one nation as we know it today, it had different provinces which were independent from each other. And in these provinces, there were laws that were created to prevent, monitor, and control people and suppress people from practicing their African spirituality. For example, in Zululand, there was a proclamation that was made that prevented people from practicing their African spirituality. And in the Transvaal, there was the Transvaal Witchcraft Ordinance that also regulated and prevented people from practicing their African spirituality. For example, the Cape Colony. The Cape Colony, the Cape Colony Witchcraft Suppression Act was established, and this act prevented people from practicing their African spirituality. It prevented the use of anybody who had supernatural abilities. It prevented the use of people who would use herbs. It prevented the use, for example, if you were to lose your car and you tried to go to a seer to find out where your car was, it prevented that. It prevented just basically anything that pertained to African people and practicing their African spirituality, even if that meant to just do family customs that had nothing to do with, you know, the greater community African spirituality practices. So those laws came into play and prevented those. Now, today in South Africa, we then later on, the Witchcraft Suppression Act was then established, and this was modeled after the Cape Colony Witchcraft Suppression Act. This act, the Witchcraft Suppression Act, it really didn't do anything different from what the other laws that were already there in place and were regulating and controlling African people and preventing them from practicing their African spirituality. It continued that pattern. However, it applied to the whole of South Africa, because at a later stage, all these independent provinces were then amalgamated, and one rule of law was applicable to all the provinces. You know, now it was known as South Africa. You know, it was so brutal to such an extent that even kings were not encouraged or would be found guilty of offenses if they would encourage any other person from practicing their African spirituality. It prevented chiefs from also having their own diviners and seers, you know, because it was believed that African people were able to have these supernatural powers that defeated the enemy. So that was heavily regulated by the colonizers and prevented in any way, shape, or form. So now these are just 3 nations that I'm giving examples of. But these examples can be found on the whole continent. We share the same history across the whole continent. And now a lot of people may wonder why all of a sudden there are so many people who are coming out and stating that they have spiritual gifts or they have ancestral callings. That is because we now live in more democratic states. There is some liberty and some freedoms that allow us to practice our African spirituality without ever having to suffer the repercussions for that, because the colonial laws are no longer applicable in some of the nations in Africa. And unfortunately, the thing with gifts, they get passed down from generation to generation, and they don't stop simply because there are laws that the government establishes preventing them to to operate, you know, because our ancestors at the time also tried to find alternatives and in Christianity that would conform with Christianity to ensure that their gifts were operating. But now, I mean, do understand that the time that we're living in, we are able to practice our African spirituality. Therefore, there's no better time than the present to call people back to the original state that it was before colonization and slavery was a thing on our continent, you know? So that's mainly one of the reasons, and people don't really understand their African spirituality, so they tend to look down upon it and still call it evil because they lack understanding and knowledge of the history of their own history and where they come from and how they have the religions that they are holding on to. Anyway, thank you so much for watching once again. I hope that this video was informative and has given some highlight and background on the journey of African spirituality, more so how colonial laws affected how the African people practice their African spirituality. I hope to see you on the next video. So bye.